Welcome to the University of Nottingham and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and another in the Why Studies series. With me today is Dr. Jon Hoover, our expert in Islamic Studies, and he's here to try and answer the question, why study Islamic Studies? Jon, welcome. And can you try to answer why study Islamic Studies?
Well, the religious tradition of Islam is very rich, and it represents the experience of Muslims for 1,400 years. Today, the Islamic world numbers over 1 billion people, and so you have a very rich tradition of reflecting on what God has given them, what God has given Muslims in terms of commands, things to do, and this hermeneutical process of discovering what people are saying in response to God's command and what they're doing in response to God's command is very fascinating. And it's obviously important for Muslims themselves to study this and the historical record of what has happened in their own search for meaning, their own search for what God has given them to do and what God has given them to believe. And I think it's also very important for everyone, not just Muslims, to study this tradition, because it helps people who are not Muslims reflect upon their own beliefs and their own practices in light of another. It forms a kind of mirror for them in which they can see themselves. So someone has said, I forget who, that you don't know one religion until you know two or more. And this is this mirror function of enabling people to, whether they're Muslims themselves or not Muslims, to reflect on their practice and their beliefs from a different perspective. I tend to work historically and anthropologically, and this allows people to communicate together who are in different planes or different of different beliefs and talk to each other about what's happening there.
So it's the sense that it's only when I discover the other I actually discover the self.
Indeed, yes.
And it's interesting that as you talk about studying Islam, you say it's studying a people and how they relate to a divine revelation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just sort of looking at a group over there.
That's correct.
That's actually a slightly different vision of the study of religion to the way many people would think of it.
Perhaps. Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you're getting at?
A lot of some people say, like say for instance, I'm studying French culture. Mm-hmm. You could say that I'm just looking at how French people live, mm-hmm. and I'm sort of hovering over them in a sort of an intellectual helicopter. Yes, yes. But what you're actually saying is, to engage in the study of Islam is actually to see how a people relate to a tradition,
yes,
to a revelation.
Indeed. Yes, and that engagement is something that anybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, can engage in as an intellectual pursuit, as an attempt to understand how other human beings, how human beings in general are trying to respond to something coming from outside of themselves.
Yeah. So the object becomes the other who reflects me, not the other which is an object.
Indeed, yeah.
Tell me, what are the major difficulties of trying to... people say trying to discover what any other human being is about, mm-hmm. is perhaps the most difficult intellectual act. What are the difficulties in trying to understand another religious tradition?
When it comes to the Islamic tradition, perhaps one of the biggest difficulties for people who don't grow up in it is understanding the world of vocabulary. There's a lot of Arabic within the Islamic tradition, Arabic being the language of the Qur'an, being the language of the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad. And people, when speaking English, for example, preaching in mosques and so on, use a lot of Arabic terms. And students who are not familiar with that, Muslims or non-Muslims, sometimes find it difficult to grasp all that, because you've got to learn the Arabic terms before you can begin to understand the content.
Okay, could you give me a couple of examples?
I just translated a term, Islamic tradition. What I meant was hadith and sunnah.
Okay.
The sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad is the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. Tradition, perhaps not an exact translation, but I tried to get that going. So sunnah, hadith. The hadith is a a report of the Sunnah of the Prophet's behavior. Perhaps we could translate that.
And can you explain everyone uses the word Qur'an.
Right.
Etymologically, it means writing.
Recitation.
Recitation.
Yes.
What exactly can you try to give me a sort of a snapshot of what the Qur'an is and how it's seen?
Okay, the Qur'an in traditional Muslim belief is a direct recitation of God, mediated through the angel Gabriel to the Prophet Muhammad. So the Prophet Muhammad heard the Qur'an, heard the recitation, and then the Prophet Muhammad transmitted that verbally to his followers, and then they transmitted that on through the centuries from one generation to the other. It's quite fascinating that the Qur'an is most fundamentally a verbal text, and a verbal revelation. It's not a written text fundamentally. The written text is there to aid memory, and that's become quite a careful science, the whole textual transmission of the Qur'an. But fundamentally, the Qur'an is a revelation of God to the Prophet Muhammad, which is then transmitted orally.
Islamic studies 100 years ago in the West was a form of Orientalism.
Sure.
How, in the light of recent developments, and I'm thinking particularly of 9/11,
Sure.
how has that impacted on Islamic studies, and how is Islamic studies, I know there's two questions, but how is that impacted, how is it different to the sort of Orientalist vision of Islamic studies?
I think there's a tremendous diversity of ways in which Islam is studied these days. You have people coming at it even from perspectives of English literature and literary analysis of novels and so on that are written by people in diverse cultures, whether it be the UK or whether it be in Somalia or wherever. So tremendous diversity. It's not just studying text. The Orientalist approach was, of course, to study text and extrapolate what the religion of Islam is from that. I think what's more important than 9/11 is the fact that in Western universities and Western settings now, we are studying the Islamic tradition in the midst of a cultural interchange that's happening in Western societies. It's not that it's something way out there. It is among us, and we need to take account of that and integrate the voices of Muslims into this discussion. And they're coming, I mean, it's not a problem, to interact with this. And you get a dialogue in the classroom, you get a dialogue in the university setting of the Islamic tradition with other traditions in Western societies. And I think that's a profound change from 100 years ago. And I think that's more important than 9/11, which of course has brought the many people into the conversation who may not have been interested beforehand. But this intersection between the Islamic tradition and the various traditions of Western societies has been going on for decades, and it's only increasing and will become, I think, more fascinating to watch as time goes on.
Can you, anyone listening to anyone watching this video, one of the sort of fundamental questions that comes to mind when I say study Islam, can you say a word about the difference in the Sunni and the Shia? Because we hear these every night on the radio, every night on the television and the radio, we hear the difference between the Sunni and the Shia. Can you try to bring us some help on this?
I work at a doctrinal perspective. There are other ways of looking at it, but from a doctrinal perspective, it's a fundamental disagreement over who had the right to lead the Islamic people after the Prophet Muhammad died in 632 AD, in Common Era. So the Shia say that Ali should have been the rightful first leader, and the Sunnis say that Abu Bakr, who was in fact the political leader first, has that right. So it's a disagreement not unlike between Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy over leadership. Right. So that's the fundamental issue. It's down to leadership and the doctrine of leadership.
Islamic studies is a giant field, and this is just a taster to try and introduce it. If you had to choose one book in English that would be the first book someone would read, what would you pick?
I hate that question.
I know you do, but I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm your colleague. I'm not necessarily your friend.
Yeah. I've appreciated David Wayne's book, Introduction to Islam, if I remember the title correctly.
David Wayne, Introduction to Islam.
I think that's the title. It's a very rich text. It's often too difficult for beginners, but that's the one I recommend highly. I don't use it in my classes, but that's the one I recommend.
Okay, well, that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you, John. We are actually friends. I want to get that out. You have been listening to Dr. Jon Hoover of the Department of Theology and Religious Studies here in the University of Nottingham. I hope that this short introduction to why study Islam has whetted your appetite to go and learn more. Thanks for watching. Thanks, John.